So I am going to remind you, for anybody that's come in, we do have an overflow room, 400 Southeast, for anybody. If you don't want to stand, this is probably one of our larger rooms, but if you want to go to, you'll be able to see everything as well, just letting you know. A couple of points we're going to make today. Just because the room is full so everybody can see, we're not going to allow any signs, no signs to be held up. There are people behind you and there are cameras here, so no signs today. Again, 400 Southeast, if you want a little more elbow room. We're going to also make sure that today we're going to be respectful of everybody, so there's going to be no shouting. We're going to keep if you can. I understand that this is an emotional issue and there's a lot of passion, and we respect that, but we are going to ask the people not to yell or shout during this informational hearing today. So I just want to remind people, let's be respectful to everybody that's come. Some of these folks that have come today have come quite a ways, and we appreciate and want to make sure that they're heard today as well. So that being said, I'm going to call the meeting to order of the Committee of Elections and Campaigns, and we're going to call the meeting order. So that being said, I would like to let's do the roll call first.
Yeah, Representative Branchin.
Here.
Representative Sanfilippo, Representative Tessler, Representative Thiesfeld, Representative Murphy.
Here.
Representative Roser.
Here.
Representative Spreitzer. Here. Representative Subeck. And Representative Emerson.
I'm also going to remind folks that we do have Wisconsin Eye here. If we could put our cell phones on vibrate or make sure they're turned off so they're not going off in the hearing. I got to check my own. That would be really respectful, and we'd appreciate that. That being said, Representative Subeck, would you do the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Thank you for the notes. All right, the Committee on Campaigns and Elections being called to order. We are going to have an informational hearing from our speakers, Catherine Engelbrecht, Greg Phillips, and attorney James Bob. So that being said, we're going to just hand off Ms. Engelbrecht and Mr. Phillips, if you'd like to start.
Great. Thank you so much for having me today, committee, and for all of you who've come. We appreciate it. And thanks also to our sponsor, First Freedoms, who made everything that we're going to show you today possible. My name is Catherine Engelbrecht. I'm the founder of True the Vote, and to my right is Greg Phillips with OPSEC, which is the group that we hired to conduct the project that we're going to go into today. We are here to present a portion of work relative to Wisconsin, which is part of a much larger national effort started in August of 2020, and really a movement that began back in 2010 when True the Vote was first established. Our hope is that the information we provide will help you avoid repeated abuses of process that diminish the sanctity of all votes, no matter who those votes are cast for. Now let's level set. For the past 16 months, we have heard the repeated refrain from those responsible for overseeing elections that this was the most secure election ever, and to think otherwise is a lie. But America knew differently, and they were right. It was not the most secure election ever. It was quite possibly one of the least. We've watched the mass mail-out of paper ballots to highly inaccurate voter records, the harried installation of by-mail absentee ballot drop boxes privately funded by billionaire tech magnates, and the hundreds of legislative changes, lawsuits, consent decrees, all that fundamentally altered election processes. And all of this came together in 2020 under the fog of COVID. It's hard not to look at the confluence of events and come away with any conclusion other than that it was planned. Having studied election process for decades, our team was well aware of the pitfalls associated with America's uniquely insecure approach to elections. We knew that attempts to prove certain types of election malfeasance would likely not be successful. So we chose instead to focus on the grifts that would necessarily leave trackable, provable data trails. We formed a working hypothesis based on, in part, informant testimonies from across the country. And it went something like this. If nonprofit groups, being funded by CTCL and others, were going to exploit weaknesses in our election process, then the exploitation would likely involve mail ballots, which are notoriously insecure, and the newly introduced and highly unregulated absentee ballot drop boxes. It is worth noting that in August of 2020, the Wisconsin Election Commission announced their commitment to follow Dropbox guidelines established by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, also known as CISA, which included video surveillance of the Dropboxes among 4 pages of standards. WEC did not follow through with that commitment. And so while Wisconsin voters were given to believe that there were security measures in place, open records requests, as you can see on the screen, open records requests confirmed that while there was in fact no video available for review, we asked every municipality, and our original project started in Milwaukee County, and we, through open records, requested video from every municipality in April of 2021. And we got back records from Brown Deer, who had 2 drop boxes, and it happened that they had a camera that was reasonably close, and they were very gracious in sharing the video. No other municipality had records. And so, with all of that as a backdrop, we conceived of a way to use commercially available cell phone data to measure whether or not we could prove that absentee ballot drop boxes were being abused in Wisconsin. And those findings are really what today's hearing is about. So I'd like to hand it off to Greg Phillips to explain where we went next.
So, thank you for giving me the opportunity to come visit with you. Just a point of personal privilege, I just got back from Ukraine, and so I'm a little edgy. So if I miss something, I'll go back and pick it up. But I do indeed get the fun part. So all of your phones, if you still have them on, I know you offered that we turn them off, but if you have the phone, go to your text and type star pound 06 pound. What that will give you is a series of numbers, unique device IDs, if you will. They're called a number of things, but the purpose of the device IDs is to give marketers and others an opportunity to, you walk into a Starbucks and all of a sudden you get 20% off of a latte. Well, that's how they do it. They pick up your number and shoot you a text. And so with that as sort of a backdrop, one thing we've learned in our explanations is that seeing really what's out there is more startling almost than the presentation itself. So the New York Times did a 8-part series several years ago, specifically related to privacy. But can you roll it down for me? I'll go a little slow so we'll pick up. Each of the green dots here represents call it a cell phone ping or a cell phone signal. Those signals are collected by 364,000 apps or so. About 27,000 of those apps are legitimate. Those pings are then collected by brokers, sold and then collected by brokers. Those brokers then roll them up and sell them to everyone from, federal law enforcement agencies to Starbucks and everywhere in between. And each of these pings in here, you see Mar-a-Lago there, each of these pings, again, represents a location where a phone was at a particular time. If you'll scan down. What the market has been able to do, what this particular one does is add an additional component, and that's time. So it's one thing to know where my phone is in the world. It's quite another to know that I'm on the 4th floor, so the elevation. But also if you add time to that, it gives us 4 dimensions that we can then compile into what's called a pattern of life. If you'll scan down to the Central Park example. So you got to go kind of slow through this. So this is Central Park, and they created a really interesting and unique example here. So all these are cell phones on the perimeter of the park, unique cell phones, about 10,000 different phones. And what they're looking for one particular phone. And then once they find it, we have the device ID, the unique device ID. And from that, slow down a little bit. And then from there, what we do is, well, where else has this phone been? And then when we add the element of time to it, we get the pattern of life. Where does this person go? What do they do? Where do they sleep? Where do they work? And we have the ability to track down, depending on the app, down as close as a few inches. Primarily for this purpose, we would back off a little bit from that because we want to ensure it's a little bit more art than science, or maybe a combination of both. We want to ensure that we don't inadvertently include someone in our review, but we also don't want to inadvertently exclude someone from our review. So with that said, these phones and those IDs that you picked up from that code, this is a quote from a Georgetown law professor: DNA is the only thing harder to anonymize than precise geolocation data. It is immutable. Now, there are some variances in how those signals are reported. It's a massive effort to both collect, assimilate, clean, before you even begin the process of putting all this together. In approximately January of 2021, after having been engaged by True the Vote and Catherine's team, we went and bought 10 trillion cell signals. Those little green dots you saw on the New York Times article, that represented 50 billion cell signals. We bought 10 trillion. The effort was primarily focused in Arizona, Georgia, some in Texas, Wisconsin, Milwaukee in particular, Detroit in Michigan, and Philadelphia. Oops. I'm just not going to touch it.
Oops.
Oh, wrong way. I think we can go there. So in evaluating the hypotheses and the components of those that we developed as we began our process of trying to ascertain whether or not there was some nexus between these cell phones, or unique device IDs, I should say, and some of what happened in the election, our analytics team, we have 12 people, and we began to unpack pretty much everything that you can imagine about the election. We've gathered more than 2 petabytes of data, ranging from video to our pings, or to our location signals, and documents, interviews. We've done quite an extraordinary amount of work. But one thing we learned is that there are 5 key components to the hypotheses that we came to understand as being, Catherine coined, I think appropriately, as ballot trafficking, because it's far more than just harvesting. It's far more than just collection. It's the combination of collection, distribution, storing, and the components of those are very clearly inaccurate voter rolls, the mass mail of ballots or ballot applications, governmental organizations or NGOs. The privately funded drop boxes were certainly a component of everything that we've seen, and then money. Money was the nexus to it all, and it really began to help us unpack what were some specific examples of what was happening out there. One of the first components of the research that we did was in a little place called San Luis, Arizona. San Luis is in Yuma County. It's called South County for folks out there. It's a community of about 20,000 people. It's right on the border. It's a farming community mostly, and is nice. It's very nice community, little place to live and be. But what we learned was extraordinary. We began to get reports that there were ballots being collected, meaning going out knocking on doors, getting ballots from older people or getting ballots from people in certain specific communities. They were gathered in a particular location. The people that were doing the collections were being paid for the collection, and then one person was taking those big stacks of ballots to a particular drop box, of which there were 2 in San Luis, and dropping them off. There have since been several arrests related to this. There's been one conviction. There's another conviction soon to be revealed. And we understand that it just doesn't stop here. We've learned through the following of the money that there is a nationwide and even international grift that has developed around all of this. Voting is only part of it. The voting is kind of a local thing. Catherine and I internally call this sort of a 1,000-front war. Everything's a little bit different, but in each community that's involved. In some communities, like as I said in San Luis, they collect all the ballots. One person takes them to the boxes. In other communities, they're collected, broken into packs of 5 to 10 ballots, and then distributed into the drop boxes. But it's all basically the same. There are ballots collected, there are ballots prepared, there are ballots delivered, and the result then, of course, is a control of the local area, the local jurisdiction. The relation back to the money is something that kind of our next step in where we're going. We're fairly heavily involved in the development of some of this with federal law enforcement. We've been diligent in turning over the appropriate information to the federal law enforcement folks as needed as we've gone through this, and they've been both supportive and helpful as we've moved through this, but there's a lot more to come there. So the whole idea behind all of this is that we go in and we geofence, if you will, draw a geocoded polygon around a particular location. So it might be one of the NGOs, it might be the drop boxes, or all of the above. And then we compile the cell phone signal data and build the pattern of life in such a way that we're able to then determine when certain phones pass within a certain area. So a good way to look at it might be, my phone is right now, since I still have it on, is pinging in here in this room. And if somebody had fenced around this room or even around this desk, they would certainly have a knowledge that I was in this location at this time. And then when I leave, it presumably would follow me wherever my next destination is, probably back to Ukraine. So we simulated 1.1 trillion signals from our 10 trillion signal pool for Milwaukee. And it represented 421,000 unique devices, meaning this is the universe that we worked from. Approximately 20 terabytes of data specific to those unique devices and those unique device signals. The timeline, October 1 to November 8, and the reason we do that, we go outside of the bounds of, say, early voting, because it allows us to build a better pattern of life. I mean, if we believe that certain people are doing certain things outside of their norm, we have to be able to say that that's so. So if they're doing something on November 1st and then doing something different on October 1st, that might give us some idea that there's maybe something going on. But the depth of the analysis is extraordinary. The capabilities of our analysts to both uncover but also ensure, as I mentioned to start, that we don't include false negatives or false positives as best we can. We spend almost as much time in testing of our theories and our hypotheses, and developing quality control algorithms that help us really define it and scrub it out. An example of this would be we had a situation in a community near Atlanta where there was a drop box outside of a fire station, and there was one of the firefighters had his cell phone had, or the unique device had sort of made its way into our review. Well, the algorithms that we use to help clean that up really helped define that for us, and so we were able to pull that particular person from the final list, and it gave us an ability to really begin the process of cleaning up our own reporting, so that when we made presentations to legislators or anyone else around the country, that we had could reasonably say that we had done our diligence and done our work necessary to ensure that that the pool of devices that we identify as being potential targets for fraudulent activity or for some of the activities that we believe are problematic really are. So another way that we do that is we go through and we refine our hypotheses. If we just said, okay, everybody who walks near a drop box in Milwaukee is a target, it's ridiculous, right?
Right.
I mean, it doesn't even make sense. It wouldn't hold water. I mean, it could be, my grandmother out walking her dog. It could be anything, and it doesn't make sense. So one of the things that we found particularly helpful from a algorithmic perspective and from a mathematical perspective is to look at how many times did they go to both an NGO, one of the nonprofits that were on our target list, and how many times did they go near a drop box? And in doing that, then I mentioned 400,000 devices or so. Now we begin to skinny this down, right? So if you had to have gone to five NGOs and 26 drop boxes, which it turns out is what it was our threshold in Milwaukee, then one might reasonably consider that there's something going on here, right? It's a little unusual, to say the least, and statistically improbable, but not impossible. And so our work and our effort to ensure that all of these target devices really resulted in, or all of our lists of targeted devices really resulted in issues or challenges that had been addressed, that we both dealt with mathematically and dealt with from a sort of a real world or a human intelligence perspective, just trying to understand what could this be, and then excluding those folks. So in Milwaukee, Racine, and Green Bay, we identified 138 people who met that criteria of 5 NGO visits and 26 drop boxes during the study period of October 20 to November 3 of 2020. This resulted in a unique number of drop box visits of 3,568. So those 138 people went to drop boxes in total 3,568 times. Just those people. Now, we could have made that 2 NGOs or 10 drop boxes or 5 drop boxes or 3 or whatever we wanted it to be. But in part because the processing power to move trillions of signals into a usable formatted fashion is pretty significant. So part of this was that we wanted to skinny it down. We also didn't want to really seek to imply that these 138 people or cell phones and their owners were all that there was, but we're also not trying to imply that that the numbers are any lower than they are, and in fact they're much larger. We'll get to that in just a moment. So what we did, this is October 20. We took a few of our devices. These are samples, and so all 4 of these devices were on a particular day, October 20th. The blue tag on them is the NGO. The yellow tag are the actual Dropbox visits. And so what this really shows is on one day, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, roughly 20 Dropbox visits represented by just four of the people. I'm
just gonna because it is kind of hard to see from here. So what is that a map of? Can you tell me of what locations that
Milwaukee.
is? That is Milwaukee.
Yes,
Okay,
ma'am.
thank you.
Yeah, now I got to put my glasses on. So basically, what it shows here is that the top left had 11 different Dropbox visits. The top right had 12. The bottom left had 12, and the bottom right had 12. And Jeff, good question. So for orientation, the Dropboxes were, man, I can barely see this. Go ahead, Kev.
So just to kind of orient you, in the upper left, what you're looking at is a pattern that shows Dropbox visits on October 20th. This device went to the Atkinson Library Dropbox 7 times, the Capitol Library Dropbox twice, and the Martin Luther King Library once, and then one of the organizations once. To the immediate right, another individual went to the Martin Luther King Library Dropbox 8 times, Atkinson Library 3 times, and a separate organization once. And then down below, we have visits to Villard Square Library 3 times, Atkinson Library twice, Bayview Library twice, Central Library once, East Library, Mitchell Street, Washington Park, and Zablocki Library, for a total of 12 very widely distributed visits in a day. And again, it's important to recall that we looked at patterns before your early voting began. So if this was a normal pattern, this would have already been separated from the core group that we're looking at here. This pattern existed only during early election or early voting. And then the last one, just for completion's sake, we go to Central Library 8 times, Capitol Library twice, Good Hope Library once, and Washington Park once.
And being mindful that these are just 4 of our 130 or so different devices on one particular day, I think you can see that the numbers roll out. And by the way, I probably could have just stayed in Ukraine because she does this a lot better than I do, I think. A few other interesting items and tidbits of information that we've learned is interesting. It may or may not mean anything, but it's certainly, I think, for the public's concerns and assumptions of all the things that were going on in 2020 with the violent riots and all the different events that were occurring. There is an entity that's funded by federal law enforcement agencies all over the world. It's called the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data and Target Devices. Basically, it's a database of all of the device IDs that show up at the violent protests around the world. And just for the sake of this discussion, we identified 10 different devices that are on, 14 targeted devices that participated in one or more of the violent riots in Wisconsin during 2020. So of our device ID, the ones we identified, about 10% or so participated in some of the violent riots in your state. So why should we care? This will take a few moments to go through. I'll explain to you some of the assumptions we made. But we believe that 7% of the mail-in ballots, approximately 1.9 million, I think, here in Wisconsin, were cast as a result of trafficking. The numbers here don't necessarily track with the 130 or 140 or so different people, and the reason is what we did with this algorithm is we included all of the people that we would have naturally excluded because of our requirements that it be 26 and 5. This interestingly is a number that is held in every single community across the country that we've looked in. And it doesn't really matter which of the 1,000 front war samples or which of the types of insurgencies are developing and are causing these ballots to be cast. It seems to always shake down in about this same 7% or so. The challenge that we as Americans face, as Catherine pointed out in her opening comments, that this was the most secure election in history. We've all heard all the media's take on all of this, but this is a number that should concern everyone. There's 4.8 million votes that were cast nationally or so in this fashion. And if you consider that some of the elections in some of the states were pretty close, Georgia being one, your state, Arizona, and some of the ones we looked at, it really is troubling that this could have happened. And I think that our view is that any community in this country of any size, whether it's a tiny little place like San Luis or a super huge place like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that the same concepts were developed, and that's why the numbers stay the same, because it's an organized crime. It was perpetrated on Americans by advancing bad process, dirty vote. Catherine will go through this here in a moment, but dirty voter rolls, ballot boxes, all sorts of mail-in ballot capabilities, and you roll all that up, and it's quite evident to those of us that have spent the last 15 months of our lives developing these numbers that this was indeed an organized crime that was perpetrated on Americans.
And so in closing, what can we do about it? I want to make very clear that we're not suggesting that the ballots that were cast were illegal ballots. What we're saying is that the process was abused. What we see across the country is that this kind of abuse is pervasive in our most vulnerable communities. It is voter abuse. And to all of the many people that we have spoken with, informants that have been a part of these processes, people that are expected to hand over their ballots, they're sort of locked in. Many of the people that we spoke with that were involved really don't even recognize it as being a problem. And I think a lot of that has to do with the sort of gray area around legal standards. What's harvesting, what's not? What is the idea conceptually of one person, one vote? And so we have some suggestions for your consideration, and hopefully what we've provided and will continue to provide to whatever level of detail you'd be interested in hearing about from us. We hope that this will be useful in consideration for future legislative alternatives. First, we encourage you to commit to clean voter rolls and real-time tech. What we've seen in your Wisconsin rolls is not unlike what we see across the country. You're unique in some respects because of same-day registration, which adds a level of complexity. But committing to clean voter rolls across the country, some 30-odd states use uniformly a group called RICO that gets the great advantage as a 501c3, which True the Vote is also a 501c3, but they are uniquely positioned to get all of your DMV rolls, all your DMV files, your voter rolls. In some states, they even get health data. And they roll all of that up for their purposes, and then they give you back what they are recommending that you remove from the rolls. And then, as we've seen, that becomes fodder for lawfare. So even once they've identified names that should be removed ostensibly, those oftentimes they're not removed because it gets muddled up in court proceedings. This is a huge problem across the country, and I would just ask us all to question the legitimacy of the problem, because the technology certainly exists in the private sector to avoid this entirely. We live in the age of Amazon one-click, when I can have something delivered to this desk in 2 hours if I want to. People are accustomed in their private lives to having accurate data follow them. We can do that with the voter rolls. In fact, with same-day registration, the technology exists and it's employed every single day in the private sector to resolve identity, residency, and citizenship in real time. No wait, right there, on the money, you know the answer. Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we as a country take steps closer to the accuracy of the rolls? Because that's the gateway to all the fraud. You got to have bad records first. And the thought that we are where we are as a country with the level of inaccuracy in the rolls, we believe is viewed by those who control the levers to keeping those inaccuracies in place. We believe that that's viewed as more of a feature than a bug. Otherwise, we would work to resolve that. Secondly, we would recommend that you define vote harvesting more clearly in your state election code. The spirit is certainly there in the writing that suggests it should be one person requesting a ballot, and it's to a common sense review, it would stand up. But that's not the times in which we find ourselves, and we would recommend that you clearly define that voting beyond your own ballot is an illegal act. Stop the mass mailing of ballots, particularly when catalyzed by bad voter rolls, because now you're mailing out to mercy knows who. Stop abuses like vote in the park, which we all may remember that from the state. We were here for it, filming it. Wild, lawless, private funding of elections, and absentee ballot drop boxes. And then make the penalty for cheating something that cheaters fear. We have to get serious about restoring law to the process. This is not about politics. It's about the principle of the process. We can argue about all the politics we want, but come election time, we should have a process that can be relied upon. And when it fails, there should be clear measures to take action. And so with that, we will pass it off to James Bopp to talk about the legal ramifications. Thank you.
Actually, I think if that's okay, I think we'd like to have our members ask
Oh,
questions
absolutely.
first,
Sure.
if that's all right.
Sure.
And because, as you can imagine, they're all chomping at the bit.
Let's go.
So let's do the data first, if that's okay with you. Thank you very much. Representative Spreitzer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here. I have a couple specific questions about your recommendations, but I guess first I just want to make sure I'm clearly understanding what you said toward the end of your presentation, that you are not alleging that the ballots that were cast were illegal ballots. So, in other words, these may well have been ballots that voters themselves legally requested, legally filled out, sealed in an envelope, and then somebody else may have returned those ballots to a drop box on their behalf. You don't think that that process should have happened, but you're not alleging that the votes were actually illegal or that any particular voter voted more than once or voted when they weren't eligible to do so.
Across the country, we've seen all variances. We've seen incidents where people are required to hand over open ballots. We've seen people that, just as you described, vote it, and people are coming to pick it up. So there's sort of all manner of things. But I understand what you're getting at. And no, we're not saying that all of these ballots are illegal. What we are saying, though, is that they are being exploited, and we believe that's tantamount to abuse.
So let me turn then to the specific issues that you have up on the screen. I guess starting with number one, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to watch some of our previous hearings where we've gotten into pretty significant discussion on the voter rolls, both with advocates like yourself as well as with the Wisconsin Elections Commission. But I just want to make sure that you're clear on a distinction that's been made at some of those hearings between the database that Wisconsin maintains, which includes both the voter rolls, the actively registered eligible voters, and then also a lot of historical data on people who are no longer actively registered, whether that's because they moved or died or otherwise aren't eligible to vote, or simply because something got entered wrong and that record has been deactivated and a new one has been created. And so I just wanted to make sure, do you have specific concerns in Wisconsin about our actual voter rolls, the active voters that are used to create the poll books that show who's eligible at elections?
Yes.
Or are you just talking about the historical data that we maintain of other people who may have been registered in the past but are not currently active voters?
Well, but they're categorized, if I'm not mistaken, as inactive voters and can be activated by showing up or requesting a ballot. And that's what we saw in 2020 in many states when active and inactive voters were included. But beyond that, I'd say that there are a couple other things that we find difficult to deal with in your data. The first is that full date of birth is not given. And so to understand who is or isn't, let's just, as you use your example, deceased and on the rolls, to get an accurate account of that, you really need to be able to validate that against a full date of birth. And we know that Eric gets that, but that's not publicly available. So that's a little bit of a difficult conundrum because you can't resolve identity in full. So you can't really get a good sense of who should or shouldn't be, even on the active side. And then the other thing I'd point to, and we all lived through this a few years ago, is when your indefinitely confined list came out and was taken up in court about whether or not that should be removed. The Eric list should be, there was a list that was given, I think it was nearly 234,000 names that were recommended by Eric to be removed, and then there was a lawsuit to prevent that. Those are the kinds of things that get caught up and muddled in bad data. So with all respect, I do understand the distinction between active and inactive, but a bad database is a bad database.
I do want to be clear that somebody can't just go from inactive to active. That if somebody was not a currently registered voter and wanted to get reactivated, they can certainly re-register. And as you noted, we do have same-day registration,
Right.
but they would have to show up with the appropriate documentation to be able to do that if they weren't already actively registered.
In 2020, if someone would have been inactive and requested a ballot, what would the process have been?
They would have needed to first reactivate their registration by supplying the required documents to register to vote at their then current address. And so if my understanding is that if an absentee ballot were requested for a voter who was not registered, they wouldn't get that ballot. The first step would be they have to register to vote.
You want to speak?
And
to
then
that?
once they're registered to vote, then they can request an absentee ballot.
But I do want to make a clarification. We do not have a real-time system on Election Day for new voters or voters who wish to change. So there is not a real-time check that we have been talking about. And that is why in the LAB report, we had numerous folks who didn't pass the check because there is no real-time driver's license check on Election Day. And even the days prior, because the clerks we have not given the clerks a process to do a real-time check. And I think that's part of the conversation about having the ability to say, yes, you have a valid driver's license versus coming back and saying, oh, numbers were juxtaposition or any of the other reasons. That would be the three reasons: driver's license number, birth date, and name. And if they didn't have a driver's license, it would be the last for the social. And we did see that in the LAB report. There were approximately 6,500 people who did not pass on Election Day, and I think the total number is almost 22,000. And they're not removed from our rolls. We only send a notice to them that there needs to be that there is an inconsistency. They still have the ability to vote come Election Day.
I think that's a slightly separate issue from what we're talking about in terms of inactive voters, and obviously the fact that there's a database discrepancy is not proof, whether someone was or wasn't, and the DOT issue is something I think we all probably want to make sure that works better. But
I'm glad you say that. I think we both agree. That would be wonderful.
We've proposed automatic voter registration that would link with that database well ahead of Election Day, so we could sort this out.
So,
but let's
get to our questions.
Yes.
There's a lot of people waiting.
Let me jump to number 3, because I think number 2 is kind of the heart of this, but some of these other details make sense first. So I just want to be clear on number 3 that Wisconsin does not do mass mailing of ballots. Each individual voter has to request a ballot. And I know there's been some confusion on that because in 2020 there was a mass mailing of applications, but a voter would have then had to actually fill out that application either on paper or online to get the ballot. So I just want to make sure we're clear that we don't mass mail ballots without people requesting that be done specifically for them.
Well, it's a fair point that this actually should say ballots and or their applications. But the challenge that we face and broadly face goes back again to the challenges with the voter rolls. The reality is Wisconsin has created a means through which the lack of transparency in the rolls causes the problem. Because if you can't, so we're in the healthcare technology, Catherine and I are in the healthcare technology business. One of the first things we have to do, and we've done this 43 million times around the country, we get this. One of the first things you have to do to verify identity, or to verify anything, is verify identity. And you have to start, in part, with the date of birth. It's a matter of risk. If you start with a non-risky transaction and you introduce an element of risk into it, say, my year of birth is 1960, right? And there was an incident that happened with my own voting record in another state where it happened that there was another person with my name born in 1960, but a different date of birth. The challenge is that it compels the citizens, the voters, to have to rely on someone other than themselves and their own understanding of how to look at the difference between April 7th and October 13th. Because if all you're going to do is give them Greg Phillips 1960, you set up failure in the process. So if you can't verify identity first, anything else that you do related to the ballots, related to the applications for the ballots, related to mailings, related to anything else is a fail. So our advice to you is very strongly that these can't stand individually. These were put here in terms of sort of our pillars and suggestions for what you do. But if you do one of them and not do the other one, or if you don't find a way to commit to cleaning up the voter rolls, creating some transparency around it so that these people that are here today and everyone else in your state can understand what the importance of identity resolution is before you even look at residency, before you look at citizenship, before you look and see if they're still alive. It's irrelevant. You have to fix the transparency issue. You can't take the rest of these out of context because, as we said, our point of this is for you to be a model going forward and for Wisconsin to have an opportunity to really step forward, then you have to be able to take each of these in context, stop hiding behind WEC, stop hiding behind Eric, stop hiding behind this idea that privacy is somehow being protected because you don't include the full date of birth. Nonsense. What's protected is the grift. So if we don't fix identity, nothing else on here matters. But you also can't take these out of context.
I think you might.
Let's please. I'm going to ask you, please. I appreciate the answer. I'm going to move on to another question, if that's okay.
Could I do one more and then I'm done with this slide?
I'm going to go on to someone else.
Put me back.
Representative Rose, are you next?
Thank you. I need to prioritize my questions because I have a few, so I'll ask a couple, and then I'll come back to a few questions. You mentioned these NGOs. Can you give me some examples of the NGOs that these people that pinged visited? Can you give me some names of those NGOs, please?
Not at this time. We've got several things ongoing related to some legal strategies and some other matters, but
okay. That would be interesting because I would be interested in knowing what those NGOs
Yes, ma'am.
were. The other question I have, if I may, Madam Chairman, is I believe, Catherine, it was you that used the phrase exploited weaknesses in our process. We know about those weaknesses, okay? I just had my legislative assistant bring a timeline of all the election reform laws that we have passed.
Many pages.
I've got it right here. And are you aware that we have addressed that list of things? We are the legislative branch of government. We are not the judicial. We are not the executive. Many of the election reform bills that we passed were vetoed by the governor. And it's not that we've ignored these weaknesses that have been identified. They were identified by Will. They were identified by the Legislative Audit Bureau. And we all agree that there were weaknesses in the process that we have attempted to tighten up. And that exploitation was done nefariously, and I absolutely agree with you. But I want you to know that we have not taken those weaknesses that you have identified lightly.
No,
we have recognized that they have occurred, and I have a multi-page document here of election reform bills that we have passed. And I wanted to make sure that you knew that we as legislators were serious about addressing the weaknesses that have been identified. And I repeat again, we are the legislative branch of government. We cannot enforce the law that is up. And we've got judicial problems because we wished that some of those weaknesses had been taken to court. So I wanted to make that, and I just want to make sure that you were aware that we have addressed the weaknesses that you have identified. And I wish I had time to look through this list of bills so that I could specifically address those 5 things that you have mentioned there to let you know. And are you aware that we have addressed those weaknesses? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for that work. The season that we've all just come through, I don't know how many of you in the chamber feel like this, but I still feel like it's kind of still 2020, like it's just continues to slide forward.
Yeah, and we'd like to move past.
Yes,
Thank you.
And the work that you've done is commendable. I mean, it is important to recognize. We hope that what we're providing is additional support for maybe some of the things that you have already done or things that maybe need to be pulled across the finish line in some ways. And I think you had some comments, Dad.
Yeah, I just want to, if I could, and I want to echo what Catherine said. I mean, we absolutely, of course, recognize that there are a lot of other states that haven't been as diligent as you have, but there are still some remaining questions and holes. For instance, completely banning the ballot boxes would be a great step. Two other important steps, both related to transparency in my previous comments, would be to reduce or eliminate the cost of the voter rolls to the average citizen. The fact that you charge $12,000 is, it's not, sustainable for a small group who just wants to help clean up the rolls, and it just doesn't make sense. And then the final piece, of course, is the date of birth issue. If you can't solve identity, you can't do anything else. And you have to fix that. And if we do fix that, It'll go along and reduce the price of these rolls, and then let these good people and others in your state spend their time evaluating whether or not these people should be on the rolls or not, or shouldn't be, and then taking appropriate action as citizens. That's the greatest next best step you could do. Kill the price that WEC's charging. Force them to transmit DOB inside the list. And if you want to set up some bounds or whatever, that's fine. And get rid of the drop boxes. You go a long way toward fixing some of what's on our list here.
If I may, Madam Chairman, just I would like to remind you that the state legislature has passed bills addressing those issues, and they have been vetoed by our governor, okay? So I want you to know that the state legislature is serious about eliminating those weaknesses and tightening up the laws, and we don't have cooperation with the executive branch.
And we appreciate y'all, and
Thank
that's
you.
one of the
Keep
reasons
going
we're
for
here.
it. That's right. Keep going for it.
All right, Representative Tussler.
Thank you. And first, I want to thank you for the presentation today and the information you provided and the advice that you gave. I also want to thank everybody here that's willing to, do that work that you were suggesting that ought to be more available to make sure that we have good voter rolls and things are as clear and transparent as possible in Wisconsin. I think everybody in here agrees that transparency is a big goal that we should have in the state of Wisconsin in every election. And there obviously is a lack of that in the 2020 election. Now, regarding the 138 people that you guys mentioned that you guys were able to identify, do you have the names of those 138 people?
You want to address that?
Yeah. There is some federal legislation that, and this has been adjudicated at the Supreme Court level on this matter. So those unique device IDs are in fact unique to the phone. If you want your unique device IDs and you can't remember that code, you can just call AT&T or your provider and get the numbers. The challenge comes, at least according to the Supreme Court ruling, I think it was Carpenter v. U.S., and I'll defer to Jim's thoughts on most of this, but the challenge with all of this comes related to law enforcement and what law enforcement is able to do. We as citizens, there are databases that we can buy to make that connection
From anonymous to de-anonymized.
Right. But according to the Supreme Court, law enforcement likely can't use that. They have to go get a court order to get that de-anonymized. It's fuzzy. I mean, one of the challenges that everyone in this industry faces, and there's a lot of this going on related to other types of forensic needs. This data is used in everything daily, from murder investigations to terrorist plots, trafficking on the border, work people might be doing in Ukraine or not. And the data is so accessible, and it is so new and fresh that it has a little bit of a wild, wild west feel. This has only been around for 5 or 6 years. I mean, it used to be you'd hear when people wanted to know something about your cell phone, they would have to triangulate the data, and you'd hear about looking at different cell phone towers, and it would come within 50 feet or 100 feet or whatever it was, or maybe not. But this is a technology that has legitimately only been around for about 6 or 7 years, and in practice, it's only been used in forensic instances for maybe 4 or 5. So it's a new frontier. The answer to your question is yes, we know, but it's a matter for law enforcement. You're not law enforcement, but if someone in law enforcement would need to know, they would need to take the device IDs. Our view of it is they would need to take the device IDs and present them to a court for that to be unmasked.
Well, and also, I wanted to say this earlier. Thank you for your work in Ukraine, and I hope that the state of Wisconsin will do our part in helping the people of Ukraine, given obviously what's happened to them. Now, regarding that 138 people, though, like, how do we know? Like, for example, I just kind of did some quick math, and that's 3,568 tings divided among 138 people is 25 tings per person. I'm just wondering, like, how do you know, and I'm just, hopefully this is a softball, and I would imagine this is something that isn't particularly novel and that you've thought of, but how do you know that 25 tings isn't just somebody that lives around that ballot box or works around that ballot box? And I can think in my life, there's certain places that I'm sure I would ting 25 times because I just happen to walk by it every day. You know, how do you just identify that?
That's why we use the pattern of life and we go outside the bounds of just the early voting. Because
Okay.
we want to know if you're doing that. If you're doing that, you would not have been included in. We would consider that a false positive.
Okay.
So the import of looking at the pattern of life outside of the voting period is critically important. The other thing you should know about this is extremely expensive data, and there's a few folks here in the room that that were instrumental in our ability to look at this at all, but their willingness to step forward on behalf of the citizens of Wisconsin and support the work really was with the caveat that we, as Catherine often says to us, don't make a mistake. You can't make a mistake here, right?
Yeah, no,
You can't be wrong.
I imagine this is what I think of.
And that's been something that's really I know that these folks here support and Catherine expects and orders of us, both contractually and otherwise. So we recognize the challenges but the import of getting this right is critically important. We're not trying at this point to do anything other than to make suggestions that we believe would help the citizens of Wisconsin have a belief that free and fair elections are legit and possible.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I echo Representative Roser's comments regarding the work we've done, and that I think we've hit those bullet points, and I wish we'd have done some of that work sooner. But speaking of sooner, can you compare how? Because ballot harvesting isn't necessarily a new thing. It's not something they just did in the 2020 election. It's something that's been
correct.
around for a while. How does the 2020 election compare to other ballot harvested elections numerically? I mean, do we see an increase, or is it always about 135,000 ballot harvested? Or, I'm just kind of wondering the overall timeline.
Well, I mean, we can only practically speak to what we've measured, right? So we know what happened in 2020 and then in the case of Georgia in the 2021 runoff. But prior to that, drop boxes, at least as we saw them used in 2020, weren't really a thing. And so that left mail ballots to be largely used with U.S. Post Office boxes. That carries with it a higher penalty if you engage in fraudulent behavior because that becomes a felony. So it changes behaviors. We certainly have had instances reported over many years of ballot fraud through mail ballots. Our hypothesis coming into this project was, what were the new variables that were the most likely targets for fraud? So, you think about kind of what we did, and believe me, we think about this all the time because this is a project that could never end. You could just keep checking things, right? But so we only geofenced around in the counties in which or the densities around which we looked, only around the drop boxes. Had we geofenced around also mailboxes and so forth? Who knows? Who knows what that number would have been? You can go back in time with this data, but it's cost prohibitive and very time consuming. So I'd be remiss to really tell you, is it the same or is it more? Based on everything we've seen, I think that 2020 was sort of a perfect storm of changes and irregularities that led themselves to be exploited. What will be interesting, though, is certainly now because we've sort of broken this ground in this way, I suspect we won't be the last group doing this kind of work, and I hope not. And it will be interesting to see what happens from here.
All right, thank you.
Representative Subak.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. I guess first thing I want to ask is just to be really clear, because you're talking about, in the case of Milwaukee, the sampling of data that you've provided us, 138 individuals, but you've also said that, and I'm going to miss what the quote was, I jotted it down somewhere, but basically you said that this doesn't mean that those ballots were illegal. So I want to just be really clear. Are you saying that that this is evidence of fraud or not?
What we are saying is that this is evidence of what we consider to be ballot trafficking, that your law suggests is illegal in practice. The voters on the other end of that process, whether or not they engaged wittingly or unwittingly, whether or not they were paid for their ballots or not, that's a whole nother matter, honestly. And we've seen it across the country in a variety of ways. Some people willingly bring their ballots to churches and get paid for that. I mean, there's a variety of ways in which this happens. The really troubling part about the process, and this has been consistent, is that when you are involved in a community or in a network, and broadly just in an environment where it's acceptable, where that's an okay thing to bring your ballot and get paid for it, sealed or not, you bring your ballot and you get paid for it. Or, I mean, there's so many ways to get at this, right? You can get paid for your ballot. You can, in the case of mailing out of a ballot, it just maybe never arrives in your mailbox and you don't know and it's gone. You can be required, as we've seen in many states, to hand over an open ballot. We don't want to, and are not trying to split the baby on exactly which way these votes were actually collected, because there's all manner of ways. But no matter how you slice it, we believe it's voter abuse, because to believe that you need to hand over your ballot under any circumstance is abusive, and it's not fair to the voter. And I think we collectively need to do a better job of reinforcing the pride of being able to deliver that ballot, ideally in person, but if it's going to be in a mailbox, so be it. But this notion that, I mean, I cannot tell you guys how many people we have talked with that it's what we always do.
So let me ask, because you talked about being paid for ballots, you talked about being forced to give up your ballot. Mm-hmm. Do you have any evidence of any of that happening? I mean, I don't see how in phone records you take the leap from that to somebody's being paid or somebody's.
No, it's a great question. And so what happened, really, that kind of kicked all this off for us was we had an election integrity hotline that we set up. When we do this every cycle, but we set it up in 2020 in September-ish, late September, and we received all manner of calls. Some of the calls that came in had some similarities that suggested that they were a part of something, either part of or witness to these kinds of activities. And so, yes, we did get informants coming forward and have evidence of that. Now, in the states where there was video, we have video evidence. There, unfortunately, and contrary to what WEC told your state, there's not video here.
Okay, so were those hotline calls coming in about specifics in Wisconsin?
Yes.
Okay, can you share with the committee or have you shared with law enforcement who was involved in that and what was involved?
We would love to share this with law enforcement, and if anybody here can make that connection, that we'd love that.
I mean, I guess that I don't know why you need to make a connection with law enforcement. If you have evidence of a crime, any individual who's a citizen, any individual citizen or not, actually can report a crime. I'm surprised here if you have that kind of evidence that you have not actually done that. It seems that would have been a very logical first step. So that said, you're not presenting the committee with evidence of crimes occurring, evidence of voter fraud. I want to move on to your recommendations, and I wanted to ask specifically about Democracy in the Park. I live here in Madison, where Democracy in the Park was part of our offerings as ways to return your absentee ballot or to register to vote. Mm-hmm. So I want to be really clear, because I know you said you were here for it. I did not vote at Democracy in the Park. It was one of the parks is up the street from my house. I was out for a walk. I saw a little bit of it in action. What I saw were actual poll workers there collecting absentee ballots. My understanding is the ballots weren't being issued there. You had to have requested a ballot and gotten it, and you could register to vote there. But so I guess that I'm trying to figure out, when you refer to it as an abuse, what's abusive about that? I mean, to me, it was a real convenience. Yesterday, I went out and mailed my ballot for the spring election, put it in a blue mailbox, a lot further away than if I walked to the park that's a block from my house. To me, I don't understand what the difference is. Why is it that I shouldn't be able to either drop it in a drop box or return it to a poll worker at an event? No, I'm asking a question, like, what is it inherently for that? Because in my mind, I'm thinking, wow, it was a lot less convenient for me to have to drive to a blue mailbox, get out of my car, put it in it. Like, I could have done it out on my walk the other way.
I just want to remind people that we want to be respectful of everybody, give a chance to be heard, and we're getting a little loud in here. I know the room's full, so let's just be respectful, please.
Yeah, so I'm wondering what the difference is. And in the case of Democracy in the Park, we're actually returning it to a poll worker. How is that different than if you were to go absentee vote in person at the clerk's office, other than not having to drive downtown to do it, particularly given that you had to have already requested and been mailed your ballot? I mean, you're physically returning it there.
In 1994, or actually in 95, relative to a 94 race, the Supreme Court was very clear in ruling, and I'm not a lawyer, Jim can help me with this, but it's, whatever the rules are on Election Day, you can't just assume substantial compliance with those rules. The rules are the rules, and they have to be in place. The problem with Democracy in the Park is that one of the days I was here personally was in September. So I'm pretty sure that doesn't fit inside the rules that were established as to when a vote could be cast. So the problem is that that it opened the door to possibilities that were not part of the law.
So votes could be cast, though, because absentee ballots had already been mailed out. I don't know the exact dates that you were there, and I don't remember the exact dates.
September 26th.
I don't remember the exact dates of the election and counting back the weeks to when ballots were mailed. But people had to have their ballots already.
It was 3 weeks early.
Right, but you could, if you had your ballot, if the
It
ballot
was 3 weeks early. Early voting started on or about the 20th of October. This was in September.
Okay, and I honestly, I don't know the dates that absentee ballots could first be mailed for the November election, but I don't know what, but if it was before that period, that wouldn't have been democracy. That wouldn't have been the event. I mean, I guess I'm just trying to figure out, and I don't want to try to walk back the calendar here without it in front of me.
Right, but you asked what the difference was.
Yeah, the difference
That's
is,
the difference.
But you weren't voting in person. Like, if I had returned my ballot at Democracy in the Park, I completed. It's a ballot that you receive by mail.
What's the point of early voting? What's the point of having an October 20th date if you can vote in September? The point is.
But if you can vote by mail in September, you have to get mailed your ballot.
It was a subversion of the law. It was a subversion of the rule of the process.
Well, you and I disagree on that, and no court found it to be illegal. And I know that there were legal challenges to that.
As you said when we first started, that this isn't a court, this is a legislative.
Sure, no. I'm just when you say it's a subversion.
I want to remind people, we need to have a semblance of order. I want to make sure that both parties can be heard here and being what's been said. So I understand that there's disagreements, but I am begging you, please, to keep your voice down. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we can respectfully disagree on that. I mean, it was legal. You see it as a subversion of the process. I see it as a way that enabled people to exercise their legal and constitutionally guaranteed right
Representative
to vote.
Subek, I'm going to hold you
Yes,
out there,
no,
and we're going to go to Representative Murphy, who has been exceedingly patient.
That's fine. Will you put me back on the
I will
list?
put you back on the list.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I'd like to thank the three of you for being here today. Interesting testimony. I find it interesting that my Democratic colleagues started their testimony talking about situations in which votes were cast illegally. They somehow tried to make out that if a vote came from a voter that was registered, that somehow that makes it all right. If a vote is cast in an illegal process, it's an illegal vote. A few weeks from now on a Tuesday, there's going to be an election. I can't walk in on Wednesday and say, well, it was legal for me to vote yesterday. Well, I want to vote today. Well, no, I can't do that. That's an illegal process, and that's an illegal vote. If you vote in an illegal way, it's an illegal vote.
Representative Murphy, do you have-
I love the applause. Please don't do it. So then we go to the aspect of evidence. And I will reiterate here again, we are a legislative body. We gather information, and we use that information to create new laws. And that's exactly what we're doing here. And everything that you're giving us is legitimate information, and information that should be gathered. So we're doing exactly what we should be doing here. So getting to my questions, who came up with, or how did you come up with the idea to track cell phones? Do you know how that,
Who wants to take credit for that?
how that came up?
We, as Greg mentioned, we have a background in technology, so we're broadly aware of the types of data that are available and the uses for which they can be employed. And so our thought was, given the process that we were seeing on the horizon as being open to exploitation, we knew cell phone data was available and thought that would be a good way to go about tracking it.
Okay. Was there any particular, and this, I'm going to give a shout out to Representative Wickers because he texted me this question. He said, ask about the time of day that the pings on the cell phones were detected.
Great question, and we failed to mention that. And Greg, you may want to address this in more specificity, but the majority of the drops occurred after business hours. So at the libraries, this would have been well after the libraries would have been open. Usually, you can speak to this, but I think it was generally 8 p.m. to 5 a.m.
Interesting. So you mentioned ballots that were trafficked. You used that terminology and used the 137,000 figure. Was that determined statewide, or was that determined from like the specific
Jurisdictions?
Yeah, the Zuckerbucks communities, or
Yeah, that represented statewide.
that was statewide. Okay. My question to you would be: it cost me about $69,000 to mail those ballots. Now, that's not chump change. On the other hand, for the amount of money that they spent, it wouldn't be a hugely large amount of money. So I'm trying to understand how much of a benefit is the drop box in comparison to the big blue mailbox?
Well, it's Let me share with you the way we asked your municipalities that question. We tried to understand what the methodology was around where they were placed, where the drop boxes were placed. Because, to your point, maybe they're filling in a gap that the mailboxes couldn't meet. Again, going back to the memo we displayed at the beginning of the presentation, WEC said that they were following CISA guidelines that gave a very clear steps in how to decide where to place these drop boxes so as to theoretically convenience the population. But what we saw when we submitted open records requests to the various municipalities was that there was no methodology followed in where they placed those drop boxes. Nothing written, nothing that, no responsive records to our requests. And so I can't really answer whether or not it represented a convenience. What I can say is that the processes that should have been documented and should have been supported on the basis of population requirements were not, in fact, done.
So, as I've looked at this, and there's a question I've asked myself. Is the Dropbox of any advantage over the mailbox? One of the things that I was looking at was if I harvested a ballot on Saturday, Sunday, or Monday before the election, and I dropped them in the mail, the chances of them getting there on time were not good. On the other hand, if I put it in the Dropbox, I know that I had that covered. So this leads me to the question, on your cell phone information, could you group it? How much more traffic was there in that time period in comparison to 2 weeks beforehand, when obviously then it could have been dropped in the mailbox easily and would have gotten there in time?
Across the country, we definitely saw a bump the first few days of early voting, and then the last day of voting.
Okay. All right. Interesting. One last question before.
You're moving quickly.
Am I doing
like
okay?
that. I like that.
So one of the issues that I feel very strongly about is ballots being harvested from people in nursing homes. People who really, wouldn't normally vote, I don't think, and, don't really know what's going on. Have you considered using some of the cell phone information around nursing homes to try to gather some of the same type of information?
Yes, we're working with our friends here in Wisconsin to do exactly that. We've looked at that in a few other states and have found some very interesting things. We found some specific issues here in Wisconsin, but we haven't drilled into it in any level, in the necessary level of depth. We do believe it is a significant problem.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say that in your 5 points that you brought up that we need, and you still have them up on the board there, number 5 is penalties that are feared, and I would love to have penalties that are feared, but I would love to have a district attorney other than, say, John Chisholm in Milwaukee to enforce that, because I can make those penalties as strong as can be. And I've seen that. I think about that over and over again when we pass laws here, is I can pass a law. Is anybody out there going to do anything with it, and is it going to be enforced? And that's a huge problem. And then the other thing that I wanted to say before I ended this, we talked about democracy in the park. And why is that a problem? And I will compare it to another event that they were talking about. They were talking about doing an event in Milwaukee at Miller Park, where they were going to bring in the racing sausages and the like. These become election events, and that's why they're inappropriate. This becomes sort of entertainment. It becomes sort of a festival for voting. And this is not what voting is supposed to be all about. Voting is supposed to be more serious than that. And one of my big issues with voting in the modern day is the level of seriousness is being eroded. And that's a terrible thing to see happen to our republic. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. With that, Representative Subek, Representative Spreitzer?
I have a couple of questions, but I did want to address Representative Murphy saying that we were saying, or that I was saying, that it was okay to vote using an illegal process as long as the ballot was in fact from a voter. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that in 2020, none of the process that's been described today was actually illegal unless someone was in fact messing with someone's ballot.
I think we should just address, address the questions.
No, I'm going to
from the
address
individual.
Representative Murphy, and then I'll address the question. You gave him a chance to say something. I'm going to respond, and then I will ask a question. I just want to be clear. Right now, for the April 5th election, if you're listening at home, you can't use a drop box, and no one else can return your ballot for you. Because a judge said so. Yes. But a judge did not say that ahead of the 2020 election. And so at that time, you may have your own interpretation of the law, but no court had said that was illegal. And it is now, we have a court that has said it is illegal going forward. And I just want to make that clarification.
I guess there's I think I would disagree with you, as there never was a law on drop boxes, and that was the issue. But why don't we refer to the individuals that are here today?
So I wanted to get to number 4 and sort of follow up where some of my colleagues left off with voting in the park and with drop boxes. So on voting in the park, and I don't want to belabor this, but just to further clarify what Representative Subek was saying, there's sort of two different ways that we do early or absentee voting here in Wisconsin. We do absentee voting where the clerk mails you the ballot, and then you have various ways of returning that ballot. And then we have absentee voting where you go in person and you have the clerk issue you a ballot on the spot, not through the mail. And then either way, you end up putting it back in the same kind of envelope and turning it back in. But one way that process is happening in person in front of the clerk staff. The other way, that process is happening where the clerk mails you the ballot. And then I think what we're debating here today is the range of appropriate ways that you can return that ballot. But there are two different timelines for those processes. I think that's where that September 26th confusion came in. It is true that you cannot go and have a clerk issue you a ballot in person until a couple of weeks before the election. But the timeline in federal elections, like what we were having in 2020, I believe it was 47 days where clerks mail out those absentee ballots, and I'm pretty sure September 26th would be within that time frame. And once you get that ballot in your possession, you are free to go ahead and return it. You don't have to wait till a couple weeks before the election to fill it out and turn it back in. So there's what we typically call early voting, which is the in-person component that's limited to a couple weeks. And then there's absentee voting where you get your ballot in the mail. And we're, I think, here debating what the appropriate ways are to return it. But the timeline for returning it, I think, would include September 26th. So just wanted to add that clarity on the timeline there.
The problem in our view, just to be specific, is the chain of custody. Right. When that is put in it was allegedly supposed to go into a particular cooler or a particular bag or something like that. I have video evidence on my phone that suggests that didn't happen. But
I appreciate
the bigger, broader issue is the chain of custody.
I appreciate that, because that leads to my next question, which is I am still really not understanding why you prefer mailboxes to drop boxes or an in-person event like voting in the park. So I'm just going to use my community of Beloit as an example here, because we had, for the 2020 election, we had a drop box, and it was at City Hall. It was in the driveway as you go into City Hall. There's a roundabout there, and so people can easily go in. It's a metal box. It's been there for years for people to pay their utility bills, their property taxes, things like that. And it got used also as a drop box. And the clerk treasurer, whose staff both take the utility bills and also run our elections, are the people who have access to what goes into that drop box. So, if I'm a voter in Beloit, I basically, when I get my ballot in the mail, I have three options for returning it. I can either go to City Hall and I can walk up to the second floor and I can go into the clerk's office and hand it in, or I can drive in and I can put it in that drop box, not for this election, but in 2020 I could, and know that the clerk staff is who's going to be opening that drop box and getting it. Or I can put it in the mail. But if I put it in the mail, it's going to get sent to Milwaukee. And then it's going to come back to Beloit. And then it's going to get given to my clerk staff. So chain of custody, I mean, I trust our postal service. They're federal employees. It would be a federal crime to tamper with it. But it's still, mistakes happen. And it's a lot more people that are touching my ballot between when it leaves my hand and when it gets to my clerk. And it takes time. And we know in 2020 there were postal service delays caused by staffing, caused by the pandemic. And so things that should have maybe taken a couple days were taking a lot longer. So I guess, can you just help me understand why you would rather I send my ballot to Milwaukee to come back to Beloit rather than driving downtown and putting it in a metal box that I know my clerk is going to check?
A couple things. One of them is the penalty, as the last one said, for doing something illegal in a federal mailbox is mail fraud.
So if we made the penalties comparable, would that address this?
I'm sorry?
If we made the penalties comparable, would that address this?
Well, it would certainly make it more, even. However, don't confuse anything we've said on this point with, we think you ought to vote on Election Day in person. Let me rephrase that. Greg thinks that. I don't know.
No,
Catherine.
that's how most of the world handles their elections.
Including Ukraine, by the way.
I guess that does get at what I think is a deeper philosophical issue. I think Brett Murphy sort of got at this. I think people ought to have.
Are we going to let's go to questions, because there's still people waiting on the list today, and let's get to our questions and not have a philosophy conversation back and forth. Thank you.
I'll make that a question. There are people who cannot go in person on Election Day. They may not be able to very easily go in person at all, even to use those couple weeks of voting. Maybe it's because they're out of town. We certainly have plenty of.
So let's get to our questions.
I'm asking a question. Thank you, Madam Chair. Maybe it's because they're out of town. We have snowbirds, but maybe it's because they have a disability. There was just an article earlier this week about people who are going to be unable to vote in this April 5th election because we have a judge who said that nobody else can help you return a ballot. So can you just help me understand, if somebody can't get there in person and you also don't think anybody else should be able to help them return their ballot, how do we make sure that everyone's right to vote is still available to them and that they're actually able to exercise it?
Well, certainly there are those instances where people are unavoidably in need of an absentee ballot. They're elderly. My dad's a great example. He votes by mail. I think the challenge that we face is when you pile on everything else, right? The inaccurate rolls and the lack of transparency around process and the clear exploitation of certain of the processes. Then what would normally be like, hey, maybe a few percentage points of your population needs to vote legitimately by mail, because certainly we don't want to see anyone deprived. But that tips over into an indefinitely confined list, and it becomes the theater of the absurd. And so I think if we get to a place where we can have a common sense discussion about who really needs a mail ballot, then let's accomplish that, absolutely. But with all due respect, all of the other ways in which we're now extending this, it's voting in the park and voting in a car wash and voting in, at some point we have to say, when is it too far? And I think that's part of what we're discussing here today.
And so is that really about security, or is that about what Representative Murphy said, that we don't want to make voting fun, we don't want to make it a national holiday, we don't want to encourage it, we want to be so stoic that if you really feel like voting you can, but God forbid we encourage people to vote. Is that really what it's about?
I'm not, it's a rhetorical, I'm not certain. What's your question?
My question is, it seems like we've got people in this room, both on this committee and in the audience, who are not interested in encouraging people to vote, who want to go to that viewpoint that voting is more of a privilege or something that, the people who really are motivated can do, and not something that we should encourage society to participate in, even if that means God forbid that it's fun.
All right, I think we've gone a little on the. Do you have another question for the information that was presented today?
One last question on the information. You mentioned, and I think this was not in Wisconsin, but obviously we're trying to get a national picture here. You mentioned some convictions that in was it San Luis, and I think you said there was another conviction that would be coming soon. Can you help me understand that? It seems to me either you're convicted or you're not. So, has that other conviction happened? And if so, or with the ones that have happened, do you have case numbers and things you can get to us after this hearing so that we can have some of that actual data in front of us?
Absolutely.
And that other conviction has happened as well?
They are negotiating a settlement, we understand.
Okay. I think usually when plea deals are being negotiated, that's not public, but interesting that you would know that.
Representative Roser, you have another question?
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you again for your time. I would like to go on record of encouraging everybody to vote on April the 5th. We have a spring election. I'm always disappointed at the voter turnout in that election. There are municipal races that get people out to vote, but I would like to stand firmly saying that I am a person that encourages people to vote and certainly would not want to disenfranchise any eligible voter to do so. I have a question about number 3 on your list about the mass mailing of ballots, and I'd like you to help me to clarify some things. Do you agree that a lot of third-party organizations send out mailings encouraging people to vote by absentee if they cannot get to the polls on voting day?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So because that happens, I had people in my district say, oh, I got 10 absentee ballots in the mail. And I said, did you save any of those ballots? I'd like to see those ballots, because if that's true, we have a problem here. And then I threw it in the garbage. I wish I had saved it. So we had a conversation about these organizations that send sample ballots out, and they are misinterpreted as being actual ballots. And I would think if you truly believed that you were getting 10 absentee ballots from a clerk, that you would save them. But, some people are not as sophisticated in understanding the process of others. So I would like you to help me explain to people that these third-party organizations send out notifications and say, please vote by absentee ballot. Here's a sample ballot of and they are not actual ballots. They are encouraging people to get an absentee ballot if they cannot be at the polls on election days. So would you agree with me that there is a misunderstanding in the general populace that these third-party encouragements to vote by absentee, they look like absentee ballots, and they are misinterpreted that they're absentee ballots? Because Representative Spreitzer's right. We do not have a law that says you can mass mail ballots to people. So could you explain a little bit about your perspective on these mailings that people get, that they think they're ballots, but they're not really ballots?
You're exactly right. Yes, and that happens all over the country. Groups send mass mail applications or requests for ballots, sample ballots, and it does get very, very confusing to the average voter who is assuming that whatever comes to them must be legitimate. And that adds to this problem, yes.
And if I may just follow up on that question, to me, that exposes a horrible lack of knowledge about the voting process with the general populace. I wish we had better civics classes in our high schools. I wish that we had a better understanding of that whole process. And I think that one thing this whole discussion has led to is that we really have a pretty illiterate general populace on the process of voting. And I wish that were better. I'm hoping that what we're doing here helps to educate people, but that's a real detriment in our general populace about the understanding of the process. Thank you.
Representative Subek, you had one more question?
I have a couple more questions, thank you.
Okay.
So I want to get back to this issue of absentee voting. And Greg, you stated that you think people should have to vote on Election Day. Moments later, Catherine told us about...
I'd like to stick to the information they have and not have debates.
This was something
about,
he said, and I'm going to ask a question about it.
I would
Madam
like
Chair.
I would like to talk about the information they have and not have their personal. I mean, let's get to questions.
They're here to share their views. If you find my question offensive and don't want to answer it, you don't have to, but I would appreciate the ability to at least ask it, Madam Chair.
All right.
So I can think, and then we got into a discussion about some of the reasons that people might absentee vote. I know many of the people sitting on this side of the table have probably absentee voted on days when we've been on the floor on Election Day, for example. So I guess my question is, who should be able to? Should Catherine's father be able to absentee vote? Should any of these people in the room, if they happen to be on vacation, or if perhaps they get sick on Election Day, they want to make sure that they don't get stuck because of a snowstorm or because they can't leave their house on that day. I guess I'm wondering, if you believe a line needs to be drawn, what's the line? Where do we draw it?
Well, I mean, certainly a line does need to be drawn, and I think that it's a difficult line because you have organizations, nonprofit organizations that are actively promoting. National Vote at Home is a great example of an organization that is actively promoting nationwide, stay at home, don't go. And that doesn't matter whether or not you can, just vote from home. So that's a conversation certainly for your legislative body to have. I think to Representative Roser's comment about the awareness of the general populace around what are the ways in which you should vote and the processes around that and so forth. In most other countries around the world, they vote on Election Day. And there's a tremendous sense of pride in voting on Election Day. And so somewhere between voting on Election Day, which I would consider to be a gold standard, if everybody who is registered to vote, eligible and registered to vote, showed up and voted, we win as a country. That a united electorate is a united America. That's a great thing. And then we can argue about all the rest of it, but we're all out having our voices heard. But then there's another extreme, right? There are enormous nonprofit organizations pushing to do away with that in person. And so somewhere in between there is for each state to decide, but it's an important conversation. And so I don't know quite the answer, but there has to be a discussion about it that takes the politics out of it and looks at what's practical.
I mean, I find it interesting to talk about organizations trying to get rid of Election Day. I have yet to see a national organization trying to get rid of voting in person or Election Day. There is a definite, in my mind, distinct difference between saying you should be able to vote in whatever way makes the most sense for you so that we can have that united electorate and everyone exercises their right to vote. I want to see everybody vote. And frankly, as long as it's free and fair and we have checks and balances in place, I don't care if that happens on Election Day or via absentee ballot, because you're casting your ballot with your vote, right?
Do you have a question, Representative?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes, I do. So I think that where we agree is, or at least where we're saying we agree is, gold standard would be everybody voting. I want to make sure everybody has the options available to them that they need in order to be able to exercise that. What worries me about drawing that line is suddenly you cut some folks out who no longer have that opportunity, which is why I asked the question out, where do we draw the line? So I don't know if Greg would want to take a shot at answering this, but if you were to draw the line, where would you draw the line? What would you suggest to us?
I would recommend you have to have these in place as well.
I'm just a contractor.
Sure. Okay. Fair enough. It was because you had talked about no absentee voting that I particularly asked about your thoughts on that after Catherine had spoken. But yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to say you should draw a line, but I don't hear who it is that we should cut out, where we should draw it.
And if I may, I know you want to answer this too, but it's a balance, because there are countries right now that are voting on blockchain. They've mastered the technology. It's an easy, convenient process. Blockchain offers a national security and a state sovereignty and a personal liberty. It's a great balance. That's not where we are in this country. We still can't agree about a standard form of voter identification. Our roles are abysmal, and the processes around all of that, which what we've discussed here today, that's what makes it complicated. So the closer we can get to technologies and awareness and public education, then the more options can be put on a table theoretically, because you have the checks and balances, as you referred to, there to support that. Because certainly you, and I would think you would probably agree, you want to make sure that, yes, everybody who's registered and wants to vote has that opportunity to participate, but also that vote is not going to be canceled out by a vote that should not have been cast, by an illegal ballot, or by a loss of process. So it's a balance. And we didn't get here overnight, and it's not going to be fixed like that. This is a process that has happened over a long time, and now we need to begin to take a hard look at not just the ways in which we can vote, but the processes that underpin this to move this whole process forward so that I think everybody feels better about it.
And that's why she's the boss.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I wish we could get to what you think that line would be, but I understand that you don't have an answer to that part of it. My other question for you relates to number 5, the making the penalty for cheating something cheaters there. Because right now the penalties for cheating are felony penalties. I don't know if they're adequate to invoke fear or not. I can tell you I would be afraid of that. There's other reasons that I wouldn't cheat in an election, but the penalties, if that alone were the reason, that would be enough to make me fearful. So I am wondering, again, what do you think the penalties should be? What is it that's lacking? What level do they need to reach to invoke that level of fear that you think is needed? Again, recognizing that there are already felony penalties attached to cheating.
Yeah, I really think that's a matter for this body and others. Mr. Bott may have some other opinions about that, but it's not our job and it's not what we do. But we certainly hope and respect that debate will happen and that there is some strengthening of that.
Sure. So just to be clear, then, your hypothesis is that people don't fear the penalties, but you're not sure what level it would need to go to for them to fear that. Is that?
No, I just said that it's not our call.
It's a recommendation up there that we should make the penalty something they fear, which I think the implication is that it's not. And
right.
I agree. I don't want I believe that there should be serious penalties. I believe there are serious penalties,
right.
But if they're not serious enough, I'd be curious to know what you think they should be.
Well, it's among other things, there should be more significant federal penalties in federal elections, and the federal law is completely unclear as it relates to harvesting and trafficking and what actually makes sense and what works. So I do believe there are federal penalties in federal elections that should prevail, but the rest of it is, in my view, is a state-based issue.
All right, thank you.
All right, I'm going to just jump in here real quick before. I want to talk real quick. The video that you were unable to retrieve, the video that you showed the slide on basically said the video was unable to get the video from basically a lot of the Milwaukee locations, correct? Were you able to get any of the video from the Green Bay or the Kenosha? I'm sorry. Racine. Were you able to get video from those groups?
We have not received video from them. No, but in fairness, that's still kind of fresh. We've just expanded our project. We're not hopeful, but we are hopeful. But based upon what we saw in Milwaukee, we'll see.
Okay, so this is the problem with guidance for the state of Wisconsin.
Right.
Guidance was given. There is to be available video information, and we don't have it. So I'm to be lectured about free and fair elections in the state of Wisconsin, and I can't get any of the video information. And I think that this is a problem with guidance coming from Wisconsin Election Commission because there is no penalty, there's no enforcement. And this is what frustrates so many. So I appreciate it. I would be very grateful if you would let us know if the other two communities do step forward with video, which we have seen from other states, right?
Right.
Of people taking pictures of multiple ballots, taking photos. We're assuming that the multiple photos was to get paid. And I know it's hard for people to believe that people could get paid for moving these ballots in the state of Wisconsin, but the information that you provided today makes us question how ballot boxes created transparency to elections, not only in 2020, but going forward. And I appreciate having the conversations, the pro and the cons, about the ease of voting, which Wisconsin is a very easy state to vote in. You can show up on election day, for goodness sakes. So I would hope that the municipalities now seeing this would push more about voting on election day, knowing that there will always be, those that are out of town. As a matter of fact, we have 39 states that have no excuse early voting, no excuse. You have 8 states that have all mail-in, and there's 16 that have specific requirements about being out of the country or illness, and certainly military and overseas. We understand that as well. So I look forward to having that debate, but please let us know. Absolutely. I think having the video on these boxes was supposed to give us confidence, and it was put out as guidance, and it didn't happen. Representative Roser.
I will wait. I think that we need to move on to the next speaker.
Yeah, Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I had a question for Ledge Council.
Sure.
So we're talking about the videos and the fact that we don't have most of them. Is there any law regulation around how long that video needs to be kept?
Thank you. The retention requirements for election materials talk about ballots, applications for absentee ballots, registration forms, or other records and papers requisite to voting in any federal election. And those things need to be kept for 22 months. Okay. So the question of recordings is not directly addressed.
Okay, so that's a murkier question there.
So we provided guidance, but we didn't provide a timetable for keeping that material.
Sure. Another question for Ledge Council, real quick. Events for voting outside of, Election Day at the polls, and what does Wisconsin law say about that particular subject?
So Wisconsin law does limit in-person absentee voting to a certain sort of specific time period where a person can go in, get a ballot, and cast that vote. And that has to happen at a clerk's office or at an alternate voting site. The absentee ballots, however, are mailed out 47 days before a general election. Wisconsin law does not address whether those can be collected or at another site. Wisconsin law doesn't address registration drives or things of that nature either.
Okay. Just one question about the videos. So you got one video according to your list. The others were not available. Do you have a feeling about whether were these videos that were not kept, or were they videos that never existed? Do you have a feel for that?
It's, I'm glad to share this information in whatever level of detail the exact responses we got. Some municipalities said they didn't have video. Some said they didn't need to retain the records, which doesn't necessarily say that they had them and didn't retain them. It just their response was they didn't have to retain them. In any event, we don't have any video other than the one municipality.
Sure. Interestingly, using that argument that I didn't have to keep it would say, the minute after it's recorded, I could delete it because I didn't have to keep it.
Right.
I think that's running counter to the public welfare, but that's
We agree.
all right. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Tussler, did you have a final question? All right, any further questions? That being said, James, you've been very patient with us. Thank you for our process of going through this. If you'd like to present.
I would, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have submitted written testimony which gives further details of the task that was presented to me, which is to tie this together and to provide a legal perspective of what happened in 2020 and what should be done going forward. My name is James Bopp Jr. I'm with the Bopp Law Firm. In my 49 years of practice, I have concentrated on campaign finance and election laws. I've been involved in over 200 lawsuits regarding them, usually making First Amendment challenges to the laws, and I have won 9 cases of the 14 decided on the merits in the United States Supreme Court on those issues. I have extensively practiced in Wisconsin, including a half dozen successful federal legal challenges to Wisconsin campaign finance laws and other laws under the First Amendment. I've represented parties before before GAB, the Government Accountability Board, and in John Doe investigations.
Now you're dating yourself.
No, I am. And also successfully representing parties in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. I have many clients, national and state, throughout the United States. I'm very blessed in my practice. Those include True the Vote, who I'm handling some cases for and provide general legal advice, and the Office of Special Counsel here in Wisconsin, on certain legal matters. Wisconsin prides itself on its progressive tradition, where you sought to get corrupt politics out of Wisconsin government and provide transparency. However, in my experience and the recent investigations by the Office of Special Counsel, as well as True the Vote, reveal that the administration of Wisconsin campaign finance and election laws have too frequently involved grossly partisan, corruptly political, and blatantly illegal activities by those who are administering these laws. Fair and lawful elections are critical to the confidence that the public has in our free and fair elections, and getting partisan politics out of it, ensuring that they're conducted lawfully are part of that process. Furthermore, election laws in particular are a balance. They are a balance between the ease of voting and the opportunities for illegal voting. Because not only is your right to vote violated, as the U.S. Supreme Court has said, when you unjustly cannot vote, but it is also equally violated when someone votes illegally and cancels your vote. So there has been historically a bipartisan consensus that we balance ease of access of voting with the increased potential for fraud and try to achieve a balance that means that everybody's right to vote is protected. Now, these corrupt practices in Wisconsin have been through the Government Accountability Board, by John Doe investigations, by the current Wisconsin Election Commission, and now by the Zuckerberg Five, which is the subject of this hearing. In the past, the Wisconsin legislature has made significant reforms in the administration of campaign finance and election boards by abolishing GAB, by prohibiting John Doe investigations, by revising your campaign finance laws. And I applaud you for what you are doing to try to reform your own laws in the face of evidence of serious irregularities in its administration in prior elections. But this testimony of mine, and I think all of ours, is not about relitigating the 2020 election, overturning the 2020 election. That is done and over. The only way to remove President Biden is by his death, resignation, impeachment, or disability under the 25th Amendment. And what this is about is the future, is what happened in the past, what reforms are necessary in the future. Now, a little background leading up to the 2020 election. There was a concerted effort by Democrat and progressive organizations to upset the balance between ease of access to voting and preventing a voter fraud that had been achieved on a bipartisan basis. And that was bringing about 425 lawsuits before the 2020 election, which had three principal goals. One, ensuring that people that are ineligible to vote are maintained on the voting records. In other words, fighting any effort by any state to clean up their voter rolls. Secondly, is to expand voting into their nirvana, which would be mailing a ballot to every single registered voter, whether they are on the active or inactive rolls, in order to allow them to vote. Now, historically, everyone has agreed that the most secure and fraud-free voting is in person, because all the protections that ensure that it's the actual voter, that the voter's real, not dead, and all these different things are applicable there. Everyone has agreed that the least secure and therefore more apt for exploitation for fraud is when you mail a ballot to everybody in the state. And of course, there, as you move down that spectrum, and increase mail-in balloting, your opportunities for fraud increase. And everyone has always agreed to that because it is a balance that you want to achieve, because when an illegal voter votes, that means that a legitimate voter's vote is canceled, and that is a denial of the right to vote. Now, the Zuckerberg Five, and specifically here in Wisconsin, the final piece of the 425 lawsuits brought by Democrats and progressives was to tear down every other remaining anti-fraud protection that attended mail-in balloting. So they brought suits to, for instance, prohibit signature matches between the application and the ballot that was mailed in, to strike down witness requirements that exist in some states. Multiple lawsuits attacking anything that would ameliorate the possibility of fraud for mail-in balloting. And obviously, they were successful in many respects in many states, and that this concerted effort to make our whole system way more susceptible to fraud and abuse has created suspicion and concern. And it's not just that you can prove that someone voted illegally. It is also the public perception, the public assurance in the integrity of election. And that is why many of these protections against fraud have been adopted. Now here, the Zuckerberg Five were the five, and they described themselves as this. The Zuckerberg Five were the five largest and Democrat-controlled cities in the state of Wisconsin. And it was there that as a result of the funding by Mark Zuckerberg of approximately $10 million throughout the state, $8.5 million in these five cities, in which corrupt and illegal activity, administration of election laws for partisan ends occurred by your Wisconsin state government here, municipalities. Now, this scheme involved a billionaire, Mark Zuckerberg, who gamed the system using tax-exempt and undisclosed money to enlist and provide the funds for certain local governments to engage in in partisan and often illegal election activities targeting preferred groups and preferred neighborhoods which was designed, the targeting was designed to turn out the maximum number of Democrat voters. Now, this scheme had two essential features. The first, and much of this is from the Office of Special Counsel's very excellent investigation, is one, overtly partisan. The 5 major Democrat-controlled cities received 85% of the money, and even within those cities, preferred neighborhoods and groups were targeted, which all of which met the profile of the classic and most hardcore Democrat voters in the state, and by a billionaire with a overt political agenda. 2, the scheme had 2 key elements. Number 1, which was to embed a partisan get-out-the-vote effort within local governments. Now, get-out-the-vote activity is done by candidates, political parties, even to a limited extent under IRS restrictions, not-for-profit organizations. But embedding a partisan GOT effort within the government administration of an election has 4 big advantages. Number 1, it disguises the partisan nature of the activity. Oh, it's the city. They're nonpartisan, right? They're just this is just good government activity, right? Number 2, it disguises the donors and therefore violates transparency. Because when you contribute to the groups that do this historically, usually candidates and political parties, but occasionally not for, those two, certainly under campaign finance laws, have to report their donors. And so there is the transparency that Wisconsin prides itself on. Third is that it evades contribution limits under federal and state law, because both federal and state law limits what you can give to political parties, and to a few $1,000s. Here we have tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars nationally that is used on a partisan basis to influence the election. And number 4 is that by embedding the GOTV activity in a local administration of an election, that gives that get out the vote activity real-time and cost-free access to the voter rolls. So hour by hour in deciding who to send your people out to get them to get their absentee ballot, or to get them to registered, or get them to early vote, or get them to vote in person, who is voting. You get that information cost-free, and it greatly facilitates that activity where everyone else has to pay enormous sums and often doesn't get the information till days later. Now, this scheme gave a significant partisan political advantage to those that it was designed to benefit, the Democrat candidates in Wisconsin. Now, the second key element was illegal drop boxes. And I don't need a court to tell me that they were illegal in Wisconsin. I can read Wisconsin statutes, and they say delivery, to a clerk in person. So it is not, for an absentee ballot, or placing in the mail. So these drop boxes, funded by Zuckerberg, created the critical infrastructure for the ballot harvesting that followed. And secondly, so did the advice from the Wisconsin Election Commission. So despite clear, unequivocal state law in Wisconsin that in order to deliver it to a clerk, there had to be clerks there, the WIC said that they could be unstaffed, and furthermore, anywhere, which is also a violation of a separate statute. So these illegal drop boxes were then predictably and apparently, as True the Vote has revealed, throughout the United States, these were ruthlessly exploited by a large-scale, organized, and illegal ballot harvesting operation involving not-for-profits and people working with them. So this scheme, based on the figures, could very well have influenced the outcome of the 2020 election and cry out for reform. However, it does not provide the legal basis, for actually doing anything about the 2020 election. That election under federal law is done, complete, and unreversible except in the ways that I have described, and that we should focus not on that, but on the necessary reforms that will prevent this from happening again. Thank you for allowing me to testify, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Representative Tessler, I think you had a question right away.
There it goes. Yeah, I did. So, and this kind of is continuing kind of one of your last thoughts that you just provided, and that there isn't a route for decertification. Can you? So tell me why. I guess, we've heard that from like council, but there's other folks that have an opinion otherwise. I guess what I'd like to know is why isn't there a route for decertification? And then I guess the second part of it is when you see the arguments for decertification, are those legitimate legal arguments that could be made, or do you think that those are just non-existent or not practical?
Well, the best thing I could do is give you my best opinion. All right, and I have had reason on 3 separate occasions to study this issue, including as a member of the Uniform Law Commission when we came up with a model law to ensure that electors vote faithfully when they vote in the Electoral College, and you have such a law here in Wisconsin, and 2 other occasions. First, the Wisconsin legislature does have plenary power, and I'm a big fan of this, plenary power to determine the manner of how your electors are elected or selected, all right? And you've exercised that power. You said the voters, okay? You said when the voters vote for Joe Biden, they are actually voting for the list of electors and alternate electors that his party nominated in Wisconsin. And then they proceed to, for that election to be subject possibly to a recount or a contest, but also a process of certification, where you have a law that says, the governor is to certify this, and the federal and also federal law allows a recertification up until January 6th. So during that period of time, and that's really where the difference is, everything I've said so far, I think everybody agrees to. The difference is timing, okay? Mm-hmm. You had the authority in late November, all right? If you felt that the election was so corrupt and that the results needed to be, you needed to intervene, you could have intervened. You had the power under the Constitution, and that would have been respected and certified your own electors, okay, the ones that you think were lawfully done. However, once you've exercised your power, as you did, on the manner of the election, well, federal law and the 12th Amendment kicks in on what happens after your certification, okay? In other words, when the Electoral College meets, in fact, when your certification is conclusive, even under federal law, and then ultimately January 6th, when the president under federal law is conclusively determined, right? It's over then. You can't go back. There is no mechanism, no provision, no anything that would have any practical legal effect. And let me add one other thing. Electors are elected every 4 years. Well, when they're done, right? When they vote and their votes are counted in this time, January 6th, by Congress, they're done. In other words, they're out of office. There's no electors right now for you to decertify because there are no electors in office. You're going to elect new ones, okay, in 2024. So, so we differ on this issue, and I know, and I share much of the frustration that many people have about what has now been disclosed, okay, and in my view, proven that there was substantial irregularities in the 2020 election, that a court could reach the conclusion in a recount or contest back in November, okay, or December perhaps, that there was that the results cannot be determined, and people are frustrated about that and hurt by that, and the respect for our elections has plummeted because of that in many places, but it serves zero legal purpose, and in my opinion, useful purpose, to be talking about doing something like decertification that is pointless. What we need to be concentrating on is making the reforms that are necessary to correct the situation, and that will have an effect. And you are obviously already on the road. There's still other things you might consider doing.
Thank you.
Any further questions? I think with that, I appreciate everybody's patience today. I know this went a little longer than we anticipated, and with that, we're going to call the hearing to an end. Thank you.
This program is a production of Wisconsin Eye, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit media network with a mission to inform, educate, and engage the citizens of Wisconsin. Wisconsin Eye is the nation's first and only independently funded state civics broadcast network, providing gavel-to-gavel access to government proceedings and events at the state capitol.